Obviously, today we have Seth and Grady to talk about a masterclass or in designing care programs. But before we do that, an icebreaker question. So the question that I want to ask today is, if we were to create a healthcare team amusement park, what would be the scariest ride? So option one would be the EHR horror ride. So it's a ride that takes you through the ups and downs, twists and turns of navigating an EHR with sudden drops and a lot of glitches in the system. The second option would be the revenue cycle management Rumble Rapids, which is all about revenue cycle and a lot of hiccups there as well. Or the last one is the compliance cyclone, which is obviously all about getting alignment with your legal team on, yeah, we really need to do that. And no, we don't have 2 years to achieve this. So please, can we move? So question maybe first for you, Grady. Of these three, what do you think is the most scary to you?
That is a fascinating question. I think for me, I would have to say the compliance ride, and this may be a very, very California state informed perspective, but there are a whole lot of different regulatory verticals that health plans and providers are subject to, not all of which are aligned, and I've spent a lot of time deconflicting and sorting out on my own, and I would definitely have to put my chips there.
All right. What about you, Seth?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm gonna do two. So the EMR one, my first job out of college, I sold EMR. So that's near and dear to my heart. So I'm gonna pick that one just because there's always more frustration in enabling technology, specifically in the health record, than I feel like almost anything else. But the one that I really want to see on here is basically bending the cost curve, but where the ride just continues to go up to infinity and you never come down from it. That was the one that I thought you were gonna do. And that would be the ride I would not want to get on.
Good suggestion. I should have indeed done that. Thomas, what about you? Do you have a preference?
Yeah, I always go for the water rides in the theme park, so I would definitely go for the Rumble Rapids.
All right, cool, well noted. And if I ever start a theme park, you will be invited to the opening. So before we officially get started, obviously, thank you, Seth and Grady, to make time to do this panel. I know you're super busy people, so thank you a lot. Also, thank you for the 250 people that signed up. We now are about 3,000 people and growing there as well. The session will be recorded and we will send it to everyone who signed up, and we will definitely make some time at the end for a Q&A. And also talking about Q&A and chat, feel free to use the chat. We have Thomas monitoring your questions, so you can tab it into the Q&A, and then we will sing that within the conversation with Seth and Grady as well. And then lastly, the aim is obviously to fuel the dialogue about CareOps and building care programs. So please help spread the word and fuel the dialogue on tweets or Twitter, LinkedIn, Health Tech Nerds, and other platforms that you are using. So we will skip the fancy introductions today because your expertise, Seth and Grady, will just show itself as we get into the talks. So I want to dive straight into the first question. So question to you, Grady, can you tell us a bit more about like what a care program is, and can you make it practical with a real world example there?
Absolutely, and I'll answer from my own perspective, but to me, a care program is an intervention or a series of structured interventions that drives towards a clinical outcome. And from my perspective, that can be something that's incredibly broad, like a chronic disease management program specific to managing a clinical condition. But it can also be a point solution that's deployed in a specific instance, like in an example around emergency department or inpatient diversions. A really specific one might be ADT feeds triggering some sort of initial response from a clinical team. Some examples of ones that I think fall into each of those buckets, broad ones, clinical pathways, disease management programs, social determinants of health programming. All of those, I think, are really broader care programs that have a number of different clinical interventions embedded with them that are deployed dependent on what is appropriate for the patient in front of them. Other ones that I think are more targeted might be something like RN triage, that's driving level of care routing, or some sort of expanded clinical service that's really there to treat an acute exacerbation of a chronic condition. One example of a care program that really came to mind was actually something that Seth and I worked on together in a prior life and deployed when we were both working together at CareMore Health, aimed at really hospital and emergency department avoidance. And ultimately, the number of clinical interventions there were extremely complementary. They worked with one another to make something that was a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts, really focused on driving down hospital utilization. And that included three really key parts of the three key parts made up that acute services playbook. It included deploying 24/7 nurse triage to help us route patients to the right place to get the care at the right time that they needed to avoid a hospital visit. It included deploying enhanced clinical offerings within our brick and mortar locations, which expanded our care capabilities to deliver more urgent care-like type services and thereby avoid downstream utilization. And then also in-home, hospital at home programming, where we were actually taking those same expanded services and bring them into patients' homes. And all of those solutions made up an ecosystem of tools that we were able to deliver at scale to patients in order to affect a particular clinical outcome. And so, to me, those are the types of things that really make up, a holistic care program, and jump to mind based on the spirit of that question, Rick.
Yeah, I like the explanation that you give, like series of intervention that drives the clinical outcome, because it's important to note, I think, for the audience, that it doesn't always need to be a chronic care management program. It can also be something short, but can also drive significant value for patients or clinicians. Seth, when we chatted, you mentioned the steps Walgreens usually follows to design care programs. Can you quickly walk us through these steps, and we'll dive obviously deeper into each of these in today's session?
Yeah, let me see if I can share my screen too. I have a slide for us just quickly, because I think it helps to make this more concrete. There's nothing magical about this, and this is just kind of years of evolution. Let me see. Can you guys see my screen, Rick? Can you give me a thumbs up?
Yep, yeah. We can see.
Cool. So nothing magical about this, but just this is the framework that we use when we think about program development. And we follow this process. There's always some iteration between these steps. So it's mostly linear, but not completely. You always have to kind of go back and recheck your work at various points along the path. But if you start with number one, you think about, you have to identify the program opportunity. What are you solving for? What do you actually think, to Grady's point about intervening with a specific population? What are you trying to do? What's the problem to solve? And then what's the size of that opportunity, right? So once you identify it, and you have these stakeholders in that column, I'll read through all of that. There's a couple of expected outputs that we would have in that phase, which is really a concept document, something that's fairly high level, but it's your thesis. It's the reason why you're doing it. And then for us also, we think about it in terms of a market assessment. So not necessarily a competitive market assessment, but what are the current option set for ways people are solving this, and can we learn from those things up front to identify what we're going to do. Then from there, once you identify it, then you evaluate, what does this look like? Try to size the prize. And again, depending on the scale of the organization that's working on this, it could be something very small but meaningful, or it could be quite broad and deep. And obviously at Walgreens, we're a Fortune 50 company. So for us, when we evaluate the opportunities, we care pretty deeply about the business case in general. So not just the clinical protocols and the way that we build our workflows out, but is there an opportunity that's sufficient for us to go after that will enable either cost of care savings, a new revenue driver for us if from a product point of view, et cetera, et cetera. So once we've done those two steps, a lot of ideas filter away, right? So if you think about this almost like a funnel, we don't want to waste our time doing too many more steps once we get to the place where we say, well, actually, this isn't really that good of an idea, or we don't really believe we can actualize it, or it's not the highest priority for us. Once you get there, then it's more kind of brass tacks. And this is where when I think about how I work with other people, creating a program plan, a project plan with real milestones and metrics. Can we hit these objectives? What are the timelines that we're doing it? To some extent, a really high level resource plan. Then beyond that, creating the team. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but team is everything in these sorts of development efforts. You can't do it alone. Even the smallest programs I've found, you always need a team to do it. And you want to have the right group of people for the problem that you're solving. And then the last one for us is creating those milestones, building the meetings out, and actually then executing the work. That's the framework that we use. Once you get into the place where you're building, there's quite a bit more in terms of project management and then managing programs down the line that we're not talking about here. But that's the way we set it up. The two other things that I just have listed here for us as a for-profit company, thinking about proposals to clients and how we generate the flywheel of ideas that we have. Typically, my team will actually work with our growth team to think through how are we serving our clients' needs with the programs that we're developing? And sometimes those ideas come out of work that we're doing directly with clients. So we do that. And then the other one that I mentioned here, not really in sequence, but vendor management and thinking about how we partner. I find so many times, even if you have a lot of capability set, you always need something from an external provider, right? So I made that joke up front about the EMR. That's an example. Enabling technology, enabling services, third-party partnerships that have pieces of the program that it just doesn't make sense for us to build in-house. So always think about that as a core component. Those two asterisks kind of get sprinkled in throughout these five, and there's sort of thematic through lines that we think about when we're evaluating ideas and then building things out.
And so this is a question from the audience. So before diving into this, like point per point, is this like how long does this process take? Because now it feels like a bit like waterfall, but is it like a waterfall process, or is it more like agile and iterative and focusing on different stages at the same point in time?
Yeah, that's a great point. I feel like I want to pull this slide off now because I don't want to be labeled as the waterfall guy, because I really do like agile development. So that's sequencing for me at least, just as a way to give some structure, right? There's nothing magical about those five. I think two quick thoughts. One, as I mentioned up front, very iterative, right? So you want to, as you start to evaluate, you think you're moving toward the right direction. You get the team together and you identify. And this happened to Grady and I, again, he mentioned it, we worked together in the past. So we've worked very closely on some of these things. And he'll say, Seth, you're a fool. Why did you think that this idea was good? Because this won't work for this reason. Perfect. Thank you, Grady. Let me go back to the drawing board and tweak it and adjust the idea. So there's a lot of that happens. That's one. Two, that's on a one program basis is that. So you're running those in parallel across multiple ideas. And so there's some structure that is helpful from a process point of view, but there's also quite a lot of kind of agile development going on.
Right. I could jump in defense of the waterfall guy for just a second here. I think one thing that is incredibly important, and there's a phrase from some friends of mine who work in the legal profession, which is for every 1 hour in the courtroom, you're going to spend 2 to 3 hours preparing for that one single hour. What I've found both in working through these items, as well as with stuff, that pre-work on the front end actually tends to make execution go a lot quicker. And, having the right alignment and thought process, whether that's around like what's the total impactable opportunity, or making sure that you have the right problem solution fit in terms of what you're deploying, or just the right stakeholder buy-in, it actually translates into a much more effective and quicker execution. And so I do think there's a lot of value that is created by being pretty structured in your thought process up front.
Yep, that makes sense. And then your first step is identify potential program opportunities. How do you identify these opportunities? Like, I assume that if you have like so many ideas coming to you, like how do you decide, okay, I'm now going to dive deeper onto this one opportunity?
Yeah, sure. I don't think that there's one right way to do it. I think it's a combination effect. Sometimes we crowdsource it, right? Internally, we have some ideas. I'll give you an example. So coming into Walgreens, I've been here for about 2 years. One of the things on our list up front and thinking through what are the programs and services we're going to build out was virtual care. So we just announced virtual care went live this past week. We announced it. We're going to start really promoting it into the future and building that out. That was something that was an internal thought that, frankly, was pretty obvious. I mean, it didn't take, a whole lot of real profound thinking to say, if we want to do care delivery and we want to get into healthcare services in the space that we're in, it's a natural progression. So that's one idea, just internal thinking. The other is, again, I mentioned it briefly, but working with our external partners. We work with a lot of health systems and health plans at Walgreens, both of which are great sources of inspiration for new product and program ideas because they have a need that needs to be solved. And they come to us and they say, hey, you've got these assets, you have these capability sets. Could you help us solve X? Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, but that's a really, really great way to build because you're building toward a demand, especially if you're coming at it from a business perspective. You don't want to build it and they will come. I think as you think about some clinical protocols and programs, there's certain things too. I'm not a physician, so I should mention I'm not a clinician at all. But in working with clinicians, they have some intuition, let's say, or some learnings from their experiences that are also quite helpful. And I found too at times as a non-clinician, being a pest and asking probing questions actually can tease out ideas that are not necessarily at the surface, but in that iterative process of really like working an idea out, you can tease out things that somebody might not be able to think through on their own, or might not have thought that that was something that could be good enough to be a structured program. And as you do that, that's also another way to do it. So it's sort of a discovery process of sorts.
So Seth, can I play devil's advocate for a minute? So I totally understand where the impetus comes from. Obviously, demand, but there's obviously a lot of there's a lot in the long tail in terms of rare diseases, and if you aggregate all of that, you will also come to a big chunk of demand. Do you sometimes out of the gate cancel opportunities because they're simply too small in what you would call opportunity? And how do you weigh that off against, because otherwise everybody's building programs for diabetes, right? So when are we going to get to that long tail, if at all we will ever get to the long tail?
Yeah, everybody is building programs for diabetes. I swear, like I've seen so many diabetes. And you're right, and it's, I mean,
so have we.
Somewhat in jest, but it's a really fair question, Tomas. So thinking about how you filter really depends on the organization, I'll say, right? So I don't want to speak just to a Fortune 50 for-profit company, right, trying to get into the healthcare space with more services and really being an anchor point in the market in terms of pharmacy. So we have a perspective which has certain criteria for how we think about the world. I'm sure Grady would share a different perspective coming from a different type of organization with more care delivery chops behind what they're doing right now. And then so in some sense, I think that's why these things exist and why individual people are inspired to do different things, right? I think to your point about a long tail, I can't begin to pretend that I would understand every problem as it goes out into the I can't even understand, diabetes, frankly, right? Like there's so many facets within any one of those problems. And so there's a certain amount of like personal inspiration that I think if you're the person creating the program, you have a point of view that you're going to think about when you're filtering ideas and what makes sense. So we filter it through certain parameters, given who we are as an entity and the assets we have. And I would say that that's probably true for everyone that's on the call today. They're going to think about it slightly different. But I don't know, Grady, what would you say?
I have a hypothesis about when we get to the long tail, and I actually think it's I think it's going to be timed with the maturity of specific solutions within the healthcare market. So I think right now there are to your point, right? Everybody's focused on the largest cost drivers within the U.S. healthcare system, and it's because of those pain points in geriatric populations with multiple chronic comorbidities. That's where the attention and the development dollars are really going. I'd like to. The optimist in me thinks that as we get better at care delivery and managing those types of things, we'll see demand shift to other types of care models focused on clinical outcomes and cost. And I think that that's going to follow as these care models mature and markets saturate with them. The other thing that I would say is I think to some degree, some of that is happening today. And one example that I'll give is there are companies out there, and I'm not going to mention them by name because this is not a promotion, but they are looking at things like different alternate payment models around episodes of care for specific populations. So maybe that's a value-based care bundle for high-risk maternity or something of that nature. But I do think that we're starting to see a little bit of that. And I think over the next 10 years, it's going to really pick up speed.
That's even more motivation to build more and to invest more in healthcare. So thank you, Grady, for that. Grady, maybe short on your end. Do you have like any specific framework at your organization that helps you take ideas from, let's say, the identification step to the more, okay, let's now really go into program mode and start designing the program? Is it like a framework that you use internally that can be helpful to the people listening in?
Yeah, so at my organization, I mean, we're a much earlier stage company than Walgreens Boots Alliance, for example. But so a lot of that is being much more entrepreneurial about testing things and then seeing where we get traction, and then failing fast and moving on. I tend to my own framework. So I'm an operator, and spend a lot of time thinking about the operations that drive underlying clinical outcomes, as well as where those impacts hit on our financial statements. And so where I look for validation of specific things to implement and design is where the problems are. So whether that be something that you can clearly see in terms of cost utilization data or some particular off-track performance metric within our own internal ecosystem, that's really where I tend to begin to focus on understanding what's driving those problems, and then begin to put resources and chips in place that are driving towards solutions there. And then, as far as that goes, I mean, that's really where you start to iterate and learn. And so going back to the initial example that I had given around, an example of a care program. We didn't just choose to launch an acute suite of services because we were bored and curious on a Thursday afternoon. It was really to meet a need that we saw in our patient population, both in our largest markets and across the country. And so Seth was a part of the team that really led the design of that. And then we worked together on iterating on those to successfully deploy and bring them to markets across the country.
Right, helpful. So a follow-up question that I have, and maybe Grady, given that you are the operator in the room, maybe I will start asking that to you, and then Seth, you can obviously tap in as well. So question from the audience: how do you balance the expected short-term, usually 12 months, time to return on investment versus the reality that these programs take a while before savings are realized?
Just so I understand the question is how do you balance where you prioritize your time and resources when there's a long runway to realize the return?
Yep, indeed.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, at some level, you can't get away from just the reality of that, and then beginning to manage expectations to it. And so I do think it's mostly about how you navigate the expectations of your audience. I mean, that may be a health plan customer who is waiting to see exactly what it is that you're doing. Is it providing, is your program that they've contracted with you providing value? It may be your investors who are looking at a runway to see when are they going to have some sort of ROI, or it might be your clinical team who is saying how long do we have to do a clinical initiative before we have enough data to show that we have the proof that this is really working. On the fight, I guess what I would say to all of that is when you're faced with a circumstance where it is going to take a long time to demonstrate efficacy in an outcome metric, I tend to really try to put in place, track, and communicate process metrics, leading indicators that I think are signs that we're getting to those outcomes. And so in the design of all of these, making sure that you are really thoughtful about maybe tracking the clinical interventions, what's going well and what's going wrong with them before you see the clinical outcomes show up in your utilization data, making sure you have a really structured process around that, and communicating those to your clinical, financial, and operational stakeholders, I think is probably the best way to navigate that balance. And then if you're the operator trying to figure out, hey, how do I make this work before I have proof in 12 to 18 months, I think that's where you have to look at what are your short-term opportunities to do in parallel with that, to either move the organization forward or to move clinical care delivery forward.
Yeah, I'm glad you touch upon the metrics. So we surveyed about 230 care providers in the state of CareOps, and about care flows and care flow design, and what outcomes that you track. And what we saw is that performance metrics, so things like completion rate, drop-off rate, engagement, and all of that, was at the top category metric that people were collecting. And that came before outcomes like what's the average PHQ-9, and even above financial metrics like revenue per patient. So how do you determine the key metrics to focus on in your key or in your care program? Is it like 5 metrics maximum? Do you have like a full BI dashboard with 20,000 different metrics, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my ideal state, you pick a couple that you believe are going to really drive the rest. And so my own personal framework in a specific process or a program is have one top level process metric and one top level outcome metric that you're consistently doubling down on, that you think is going to drive the majority of all the other things that you could potentially be tracking. And so I think those two things hold in balance. I mean, when in doubt, I think one of the things that any healthcare delivery organization needs to be tracking is patient engagement. That's the ceiling at which the efficacy of your clinical interventions are defined, because it doesn't matter how fancy the car is. If it's not on a road, you're not driving it. And so I think that's one that you can keep in mind. And in addition to that, I think you see that in reimbursement models that are coming up. There are I think moving from PM structures to per engaged member per month structures are an example of that, where there's really an emphasis on not just covering an entire population, but really making sure that you're driving engagement and delivering the solution to that particular patient population.
That's anything to add on that?
Yeah, a couple of points. I love that analogy, by the way, Grady. I'm stealing that. That's exactly right. I mean, engagement is one of the biggest rate limiters in most programs. It's actually part of the reason, if I can have a tangent and promote for a second on the Walgreens side. It's one of the reasons why I'm such a big believer in Walgreens, but in more generally the ability to touch patients in a slightly alternative way from traditional medicine, and having these entrenched relationships where you get to see a patient multiple times through the year, from the pharmacy as an example in our case. It really gives us a strategic advantage when you try to run programs, especially partnering with health plans, which tend to struggle with engaging patients and getting them signed up to do these things, right? Because at the end of the day, to Grady's point, if you don't have patients that are actively behaving in the way that you would like them to, those outcomes are much harder to get, right? There's only so many things you could do if you don't have a population that's participating. So I think that's huge. And then overall, thinking about how you deliver these programs from an operating point of view, I think, thinking about it from a design point of view and conceptualizing it up front, there's always one more measure that you want to think about, right? There's always, if you have n measures, n+1 is the right number. And there's real issues with that, which is part of the reason why I say this really needs to be iterative. And when you work to actually execute on it, there is a cost component of capturing more data. And then there's a dilution effect too. So to Grady's point about really having primary emphasis on a couple of key drivers, that's critical. You can always track other measures behind that, but if you have a hypothesis and those are the things, and then with a little bit of humility, I recognize that perhaps you might not be right on those measures. Usually you are, but if you're not, are you seeing something in the rest of the data? That sometimes helps to justify. And then going back to the question, just to kind of full circle in terms of how you think about short-term versus long-term, I think that there's always a tension there. And that goes back, it's very circumstantial. In which case do you have something where you want to prioritize a short-term effect? If you're a startup and you have very limited cash in terms of runway, then you really need to have something that's more upfront. You need an impact, you need a win. So you might have grandiose visions for what you want to do with a program and all the impacts you have, but you have to pick one or two things that you can really influence first in order to justify your existence into the future. If you have a little bit more runway, again, if you think about the idea of like a clinical trial where you know that you're going to set some things up front and you're going to have a long runway to do that, then you want to be a little bit more defined and thoughtful up front in the metrics that you're picking, so that you don't miss anything. And you might be a little bit more exhaustive up front because you know you have a longer lead time. And so again, very circumstantial in the way you think about it, but in any case, every experience I've seen, there's always tension between that. And depending on the day of the week, and depending on who you're sitting with, trying to justify your existence or your program's existence or otherwise, you may have a different answer, and you may have to, really think through how you communicate that.
Yeah, what I also noticed when you are in at a healthcare conference and you ask 10 people how do you define patient engagement, you will get 10 different definitions. So it seems like we have like no standardization on what does patient engagement mean. And this obviously blocks the benchmarking in the industry because plans have different definitions, providers have different definitions. So how do you define patient engagement at your organization? Like, what's the measure that you look at?
We just had a debate about this in a 2-day meeting yesterday. So currently the way that we define it at my organization is really around we basically stratify what we consider different tiers of engagement based on what participant or patients have really engaged in terms of our clinical model. So we would consider, one person fully engaged if they were, having these types of visits, longitudinally engaged under, another set of conditions or limited. In my prior organization, I think we were really beginning to actually define engagement because it was much more multifaceted. We were operating an entire network of primary care physicians and specialists in addition to deploying our wraparound model. And so, the question really was, well, does that not count as engagement? No, it absolutely counts as engagement. It's just engagement really is dependent on the question that you're asking. And so we looked at this in terms of, looking at a patient population within a specific geography and then seeing what points of our ecosystem they were actually engaging with us in, whether that was, with one of our hospitalists after a hospital admission, whether it was an appointment in one of our brick and mortar locations, whether it was claims data from the primary care physician that was in the network we were managing. It took a lot of different shapes. And we were still working on, I think, becoming a little bit more disciplined about measuring on it. But I do think there's a lesson in there that in meaningful engagement can look different for different patient populations that you're working with. And so there is, I think, a nuance there that would be a little bit like throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you were to ignore it.
Yep. And then Seth, do you have how would you define, for example, patient engagement at one of the programs that you recently launched, like for example, the virtual one? Do you have is there a definition per program, or how do we need to see that?
We do, yeah. It's exactly what I was thinking. So I'll give you two examples on in what we're doing now for some contrast. We run a Stars HEDIS performance program, which essentially closes care gaps for plans, MA and also commercial and CAID. But in that program, engagement for us is very dependent upon the gaps that we're closing. And typically the way we think about it, I'll give you an example. So we're working with an insurer to close gaps in colorectal cancer screening. So we send test kits out to patients. We call them on the phone to prime them. We send out the kit. We get those kits back. And engagement for us there is measured in a couple of ways. One, how many people can we get on the phone, right? Because we have a giant eligibility file. How many of those will actually pick up? That's the reach rate. And then beyond that, how many of them will sort of opt in to let us send them the kit? We can send it, and sometimes we do just drop shipping it to them. But we also like this sort of touch beforehand to really try to be sure that when we send that kit out, because there's a cost associated with it, we drive back then our next rate, which is all part of this giant engagement, right, is how many of those kits get returned. So when you think about that, there's actually multiple steps there in terms of KPIs that we care about. Collectively, I would put that in the engagement bucket, because now what we're seeing is we funnel down and we can measure and we can try to improve upon each of those steps in the funnel to get down to the ultimate, here's how many gaps that we closed by getting these kits back. And I think that precision helps us at times on the design side when we iterate to go back to say, why is it that when we do outreach here, the rate isn't as high as we would expect? What can we do about it? What other options do we have? Do we do email? Do we do SMS, et cetera, et cetera? And then if we do option A versus B in kind of an A/B test, and we see more results in one versus the other, we can say, okay, our engagement rate's better. So in that sense, that's how we think about it. Very transactional from a program point of view for that one. For virtual care, by contrast, it's mostly the way that we're conceiving of it now. It is essentially us converting somebody from being totally unaware that this exists as a product to actually signing up and doing a visit and completing the visit. And then for us, the other piece of engagement is how frequently that person comes back, or how many times that person comes back. So when you think about the total lifetime value for us, we want to think about a patient being engaged and having an awareness, being satisfied with the initial visit, and then coming back and doing it again, right? Because if that happens for us, then from a financial perspective, our CAC, our acquisition cost for the customer goes down, right? And the lifetime value goes up. So that's how we think about engagement there. It's slightly different because we actually care about coming back, right, and doing it again. And so that's where I would also kind of filter in from an engagement perspective, the qualitative aspects. So NPS scores are pretty helpful for us in certain cases. And then going back to what Grady had mentioned before, when we worked together, we built out hospital at home. I do think this is worth just calling out. We had patient engagement, but frequently that was measured in if a provider offered this service, you know, hey, we can come into your home and get you out of the hospital early. Will you say yes to that? Our yes rates were astronomically high, but they were coming from a physician recommending that, right? So we would expect that number to be high. So really where our engagement rate was tied was not just to the patient, but to the provider. So for that, it was how do we get upstream to get the provider interested in this program? So all of our downstream impact was really with building our relationship. And these, for the most part, were own docs, right? This is all part of our network and employed physicians, but still they needed to know, they needed to have awareness of the program, that it existed. And we knew that if we could get them, then downstream waterfall, I am going to be the waterfall guy, but the waterfall down on this then becomes the patients are engaged in that program. And that's how we thought about that. So 3 different flavors of programs, all engagement. And I don't know, Rick, if I'd love to hear your thoughts, since you've heard 10 different versions of it. How do you think about it?
It keeps me up at night. No, I think you're right that defining patient engagement in like a global definition that everyone needs to adopt makes zero sense, because every care model is different and every patient population is different, and also every organization is also probably in a different payment model, so they obviously have or adopt different patient engagement definitions. So I think what Grady and you say resonates deeply with me as well. So I think we should just accept the fact that there will be no global definition at this point in time.
There's maybe one thing to throw in here, and maybe then we need to move on to the next stages of building these programs. But so what we've also seen in the State of CareOps report is that actually what it seems like is that a lot of organizations, you know, get stuck in just measuring patient engagement and measuring the longer term outcomes. They just don't get there. And so to come back to Grady's point there, obviously engagement is a leading indicator of potentially a longer term outcome that you want to measure. And so the potential pitfall that people might run into is just only measuring and then only optimizing for patient engagement, right? Because obviously what you measure, you will optimize, and what you give attention will grow. And so that's obviously ultimately not the business we're all in, right? Ultimately, the business is tied to those outcomes. So anyway, that's not really the question, but one of the hypotheses that we had when we were looking at the data from the State of CareOps survey.
And one, maybe not, maybe it's a hot take, but I think also something that's often forgotten, and I don't want to go into the rabbit hole, but it's something that I deeply care about as a nurse, is instead of patient engagement, we should even think about just tracking clinical experience and how the clinicians experience the program, because that's eventually, if that's high enough, that will almost always lead to better patient outcomes as well. So the clinician itself and the experience there should, in my opinion, also taken into account more often. But let's close this topic. What I also want to touch upon, and this is again standardization, but in the State of CareOps, we identified 79 different team combinations when it comes to designing care flows. Like some people involved clinical operations, others didn't. So it's obviously a bit of a mess. So it's clear that there is no standard team for designing care flows as well. And we use care flows. I think it's a similar definition as you have, but for us, it's more focused on the processes that are within the care program. But according to you, is there like a standard team when assembling or building a care program? And if so, what does that team look like?
I definitely have a perspective, but I'd love to hear Seth's thoughts first, since he's the design guy.
It's funny because I was going to say the same thing, but back to you. So I'll take it because you beat me to it. But I think it's very. So a couple of points, right? There's roles and then there's people. So from a role perspective, I do think that you'll see some commonalities or some standards in terms of at what phase of the process, in terms of development and execution, that you're bringing in different groups. So up front, as we evaluate opportunities, going back to kind of the first two areas, identifying and evaluating, that's going to be pretty heavily leaning on design, a clinical SME, somebody that really understands the way that this might evolve over time, even, and ideally with the ability to do that in the abstract, as opposed to having everything built out, because early on you have to make some assumptions, and then also finance for us, and you can kind of merge those hats together if you're a smaller organization and you don't have individual discrete teams doing that. But those are the types of functions that you would have, and then as you get farther along in the process, I think you want to have project managers or somebody that has that skill set as you build out the program plan, and then from there, then you really want to lean into the teams that are doing the work, building the workflows and the protocols, and that's where your clinical SMEs are going to lean in heavily, and you probably want more than one so that you can create good debate and structure around that. So that's from a role perspective. But from a people perspective, I'm a huge fan of psychometrics and understanding how people work together as a team, and so that you can't necessarily put into the same structure because everybody changes. But one of the reasons why I was so excited to do this today with Grady is he and I work really well together, partially because we complement each other's skill sets well. We have a lot of overlapping skills, but we also have some things that we sort of cover each other's gaps on. And as a result of that, you can do more, and you can do more with less potentially too, right? You don't necessarily need 20 people in the room to make decisions. I found that lots of times in terms of program development, a small core team that works really well together and has enough both overlap so that there's commonality and then also some diversity in terms of skill sets, really actually turns out that you can get a lot done really fast. And so that's the way I would think about it, is that both of those things have to be true. You can't just have the roles and then have people that do those roles but don't mesh. You're not going to get a good result from the program. And then conversely, you can't have 5 people that think exactly the same way, even if they're best friends, if none of them are operators, right? Because you have a lot of things that aren't being executed, or you have only operators and you're not thinking about other parts of the chain that really need to come together. So I think both of those things have to be true. I don't know, Grady, what do you think?
I agree with the vast majority of what you just said. I mean, when I think both Seth and I both experienced being on the ends of projects where the right functional expertise wasn't represented, and that in turn impacted implementation and operational efficacy. But I mean, in terms of like composition of like a broader team for this, I try to think about it with 3 components, one of which is or maybe just 3 requirements. The first is really stepping back and thinking about what functions are going to be responsible in the delivery of a specific, you call them care flows or processes or things like that, and making sure that you have subject matter expertise on each of those functions. And so I don't think there's a one size fits all. I don't think there's a list of saying like include these departments, include these different disciplines. I think it's specific to the matter at hand and being thoughtful about what are the functions and the areas that I need to include here in the design and execution. The other side of that, which is number 2, is stay away from perfect democracy. I think there is such a thing as too much feedback impacting effective implementation and design. And so I try to think of it as functional representation as opposed to perfect democracy. And then the last piece is that I think you have to have an adult in the room. There has to be a strong decision maker who is going to unstick the team and to break the 50-50 50-50 vote to avoid a particular initiative stagnating. That might be that might be a direct reporting line. It may be some sort of executive sponsor within your organization. I can't say what it is without knowing the ecosystem that everybody is exactly operating in, but I think those are the three elements that I think about. Now, the one place that I do walk back my anti-democratic rant there for a minute is really the I do think related to Seth's point about thinking about the people is getting feedback from the people who are involved with that process, getting feedback from the front line, getting feedback from the patient. If you're not doing those things once you implement and go live, you might very well be just like cutting off your arm. I remember this. There was a hospital that I was working in, and there was this multi-million-dollar project in terms of equipment that was going to be installed, and it got almost to the point where it was being greenlit until someone talked to a technician who was making less than $50,000 a year. He says, it's not going to work. And everyone was like, well, why? And the tech walked them into the exam room and just said, because this room is too small and the arm is never going to swing that way. We got to do something else. Whole thing was dead. So I do think there are elements of that types of feedback that is really, really helpful.
I love that. That's a very good example. And then also, like, related to the clinical subject matter expert, when do they start designing these care or medical protocols? Like, if this and that logic, if the ADT feed comes in, then do this, and then, like, when do they come in, and how important is building these medical protocols?
I think in a care delivery organization, you have to start with clinical input. Otherwise that's just kind of left with, like, I don't know, profit seeking. And I'd like to believe that we're in this to have an impact. And so I think, having clinical expertise in terms of validating the outcome that you're moving to, as well as best practices at a high level when you're beginning the design piece, is probably where I'd begin to include it. And then, as you flesh that out a little bit further, that's when I think you identify these are the processes that we need to flesh out. And then whether or not they're operational or clinical is when you plug in the right subject matter expert to design that.
Yeah, and I think even in places where you are profit seeking, and I agree with you, Grady, like let's not just talk about money here. Like it really matters in terms of making an impact with patient care. But even up front, in order to understand what's happening with those protocols in the field when they're actually going to be live and when you're actually running them, you have to think about who's doing the work, right? So having a clinician up front, I think, if you're in care delivery, you have to have a clinician in the process early in the process, so you can begin to understand how many people have to do this, how much time does it take to do this on average, right? Is the protocol a 5-step protocol or a 20-step protocol? Do we have the systems in place to standardize this, or are we relying on hero medicine, right, in order for us to get this done? You have to understand some of those components, and either way is fine. Maybe we're not standardizing it yet, maybe we're just testing this, but you don't know that when you're upfront designing if you don't have an expert who's a clinician who can actually weigh in on those things. So if the program is a care delivery program, you must have somebody who can do the care delivery in order for that program to be a real program. And to Grady's point, you can always catch that maybe at the end, or you hope to catch that at the end if you have the expert who you forgot to ask. But if you can prevent a lot of headache up front by bringing in somebody who's an expert, you do it. And so most of the time, I would say almost every program that we run or that I've built in the past has had a really strong dyad partnership with a clinician.
Super helpful. Maybe last question, and this is probably a question that we can just organize a different panel on as well, but maybe short summary. Like, let's say that you've designed your care program, you have alignment within your team. How do you then go in launching that program? Is it one site, or is it across multiple sites? Is it all at once, or is it like staggered? Like, how do you approach that?
I don't think I've ever just launched something whole hog across every single market or site. I've almost always done a if it's new, if it's something we haven't done before, I'm almost always doing a test phase, doing the build, test, learn cycle, and then making sure it scales first before rolling it out. The only time that I can ever think of in terms of going big at the very beginning is, or having a very quick ramp to scale something very quickly, is when you're implementing something that you already know is best practice and has been validated by the industry, whether that's a clinical treatment, whether that is an operational foundational element that you just know you're going to need, and there's no need for the entire build, test, learn cycle when you're launching at the very beginning.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would say the same thing. I mean, it feels like there has to be a really strong reason to do the big bang approach or the shock and awe, like everything you happens to, and the circumstance might be something like I'm introducing a technology that only works at scale, or not only works at scale, but works best at scale, like a communication tool, right? So when I say that, it doesn't necessarily mean I need to scale it to the entire enterprise right away, but I need to have sufficient number of people using this in order for there to be value. And so that, again, is very circumstantial, very dependent on the project, but those would be the ways that I think that you would size how big of a chunk am I biting off in one bite. Where possible, starting small is nice. I will say, though, in past lives, I've seen lots of pilots fail to scale, not because the program wasn't a good program, but because the plan to scale wasn't there. So even if you start small, and I do agree in most cases you should, you've got to have the vision of how this grows and a plan for how it grows. And if you don't have that, then you're setting yourself up to fail or not to scale, because inevitably something will go wrong and the vision has not been cast and you put it aside. So the goal is, at least when we identify and sort of evaluate what we're going to build, is if this doesn't work across the enterprise, it might not be the right program. Or if this doesn't work for the use case we've intended it to with every possible version of that use case, then we really ought to rethink the design here. So that's the one caveat. But if you go big for no reason, it feels a bit reckless, right? So I think that's how we need to think about it.
And it can cause backlash. There have been circumstances where the big bang approach without the right buy-in and level of support, you lose credibility with important stakeholders, and then you lose your shot. Just going back to Seth's point about you need a plan to scale, there was actually a particular product that Seth and I worked on in terms of trying to build really selling a particular model of hospitalist care to various health plans. And, we knew at the very beginning, when we were designing that, the opportunity size that was the first step wasn't big enough to accomplish scale needed for the program to be successful. And so we spent a lot of time talking about, okay, once we get this out, we're going to have to prove, does it work? And then quickly get to scale to see the results, because we knew it just wouldn't, we wouldn't see it if we weren't moving quick enough to get there. And if you don't have that path to scale, and in this particular case, we didn't for a number of reasons, the project, ultimately, we decided to say, hey, let's move on from this as an organization and prioritize other things, which isn't necessarily the wrong answer, but it does underline the point about speed to get there when you are implementing.
That's the perfect note to end today's conversation. Thank you so much. The time is already up. It went pretty fast. Maybe before we wrap up, quick announcement. So we all talked obviously about care flow design. So the next panel that we will organize will be about how can you now ensure that once you designed your care program, that you also have adoption by the clinicians, which is obviously also super important, because otherwise your program will go nowhere. So we have Dr. Casey from One Medical. She's a senior medical director and also a value-based care educator. And then we also have Jessica Green from Time Care, which is the director of operations there. So we will go even further in the rabbit hole of designing these care programs. So thank you, Grady and Seth, for making the time, and thank you for the audience for listening in, and looking forward to making healthcare better together.
Thanks so much.
Rick. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Grady. Thanks, Seth. Bye.
Bye.